show you that later. All right. I don't think she talked about meninges, did she? I think she said she got right to this and.
She spoke about dura mater, actinoid matter, pia matter.
All right. So this really is kind of review. This is the spinal cord, and just like the spinal cord, just like all body cavities, there's membranes associated with the dorsal body cavities, and that includes the brain and the spinal cord. We already talked about the different meninges associated with the spinal cord. The dura is the thick, heavy connective tissue layer. Deep to that is the arachnoid mater, and then right on the surface of the spinal cord is the pia mater. Well, the brain really isn't any different. Just like the spinal cord, the brain has a meningeal layer right on the surface of the brain. That is the pia mater as well. We also have the arachnoid mater and then the dura mater. Now there's two layers to the dura. There's what we call a periosteal dura, which is closest to the bone. And then we have the, what's the name of that? Meningeal. That's what I thought, thank you. The meningeal dura. Now, this here is that longitudinal fissure that kind of splits the hemispheres of the brain. Let me know what this is called, the dura that kind of folds down inside. And actually, if you dissect a human brain, you can actually pull that out, this big sheet. You can actually see that. It's called the falx cerebri. There's actually one that kind of is wedged in there by the cerebellum as well, and it's called the falx cerebelli. And one of the things we can see in this diagram is that where the periosteal dura and the meningeal dura come together, kind of form this sinus here. And that is called the superior sagittal sinus. That is what we call one of the cranial venous sinuses or the dural venous sinuses. There's these big spaces in the dura where venous blood flows. Blood from the brain flows into these, and then that blood goes back to the heart for distribution to the lungs, so the carbon dioxide can be disposed of and new oxygen be brought into the blood. So far, not really a whole lot of difference in the meningeal layers. Now, one of the things I want to point out to you is that notice, and there is still a subarachnoid space, but notice that the arachnoid mater has these little protrusions that pop up through the meningeal dura there and end up in that superior sagittal sinus. Those structures are called arachnoid granulations. We'll talk more about those in a few minutes. They're called arachnoid granulations. Let me show you another picture. So all this red is the arachnoid mater. Here's the subarachnoid space. Here's the superior sagittal sinus. The meninges, or the dura, falx cerebri. And here's those arachnoid granulations that actually stick out into where that venous blood flows through that superior sagittal sinus. Here's kind of a three-dimensional picture. Okay, all these purple cells are the endothelial layer that lines and makes up that superior sagittal sinus. All the green are the cells that make up the arachnoid mater, and then these little leg things are those little web-like protrusions that stick out. Now, what do we find in this subarachnoid space here? Because that's what this is, the subarachnoid space. This is the dura, this brown stuff. What do we find in the subarachnoid space? Cerebral spinal fluid. One of the things that we're going to see in a few minutes is that the body is constantly producing cerebrospinal fluid, and as it flows through the brain and around the spinal cord, we have to have a balance between production and loss of cerebrospinal fluid. Otherwise, if the body keeps producing it and producing it, you're going to increase the volume, but you're not changing the space where that fluid can flow. So what we're going to see is that cerebrospinal fluid gets absorbed by the venous blood in the superior sagittal sinus. So those arachnoid granulations that stick up into the superior sagittal sinus allow the cerebrospinal fluid to actually get added to the venous return blood. Now we'll talk about the functions of cerebrospinal fluid in a few minutes.
It's like pressure.
Correct. If you make too much, it increases the intracranial pressure and can actually squeeze the brain. So that's the function of those arachnoid granulations. And after I talk about how the cerebrospinal fluid